excellence cannot be achieved through a lack of accountability. And so one of the things that West Point does well is they hold the students accountable for how they behave. And I think the same thing's true in the best private sector organizations. Most organizations are not accountable, they're partially accountable. They hold people's feet to the fire for some things, and for others, they allow deviations from the standard. And they allow that gap to exist so long as they're producing good enough outcomes. The best organizations are the ones that do their basics better than anyone else. Plain and simple. The best organizations are ones that do their basics better than anyone else.
This is the Business of Advice podcast, where we help good advisors become great business owners. Today, we have a very special guest. I am honored to welcome retired Brigadier General Bernard Banks. He has dedicated most of his life to leadership and growing leaders both in the military and now in the civilian world. General Banks' education is outstanding with degrees from the United States Military Academy. Most of us know that as West Point, Central Michigan University, Harvard University, Northwestern University, the United States Army War College, and Columbia University. He has also taught at the United States Military Academy, Columbia University, and now is the Associate Dean for Leadership Development and Inclusion at Northwestern University. General Banks, sir, welcome to the Business of Advice podcast.
Well, thank you very much. It is an honor to be here, and I look forward to our conversation.
I was looking back at some notes. It's crazy. It was 5 years ago that we met, and I'll share that story here in a minute. But I wanted to start off by, I think, first thanking you for your service to this country. But if you would tell us a little bit about your journey to West Point. Was that a childhood ambition? Did it develop during high school? And then maybe your life after West Point, some of the things that you've done, just so everyone has a little bit of your background.
Yeah, sure. So long story short, it was a childhood ambition born out of my family's particular set of circumstances. My father was a career military officer who had actually been drafted into the Army during the Vietnam War. Never intended to make the military a career, but ultimately decided to do so. So when my father was drafted, he had just come out of college at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland, which is where he met my mother. Drafted into the Army, he thought he'd do his stint and then move on. However, he had the great fortune of learning how to fly helicopters as part of his military activities and discovered he loved it. And so embarked on a 28-year military career that took us all over the globe. And as a young child, living on Army bases, I frequently would find myself in the homes of my friends. And in the Army, we don't really give out bonuses for great performance. We give out lots of trinkets. So whether it's plaques or other forms of memorabilia, I remember as a small child seeing some of the memorabilia possessed by the parents of my friends. And for those who had gone to West Point, they had certain things inside their home, whether it was their cadet uniform or the cadet saber or whatever else. And just the way in which they spoke about the institution, the things they say they gained from the institution, the level of confidence they possess, and also the level of collegiality they had when talking with their peers who had gone to West Point, I quickly discerned as a young child that it was a special place. And so in talking to my parents and reading up on it, I decided at a very young age, West Point was where I wanted to attend college. And so I set about on that journey, from as early as I can remember. And ultimately was fortunate that it came to fruition. So when you think about, hey, was West Point something that was pushed on me by others? The answer is no. Was West Point something I was pushing for from a young age? The answer is yes. And I was very, very fortunate to find myself there. And the things that I learned there, the people that I met, and the ideas and values that it instilled in me are things that I hold near and dear to this very day. And so it is a place that I sought to become a part of. It's a place that now is a part of me. Every time I return there, I find myself re-energized. And every time I depart there, I leave knowing that I have an obligation to uphold what that institution has come to represent, not only here in the United States, but also around the globe. So it's a very special place.
That's very cool. Our chief investment officer here, Tom Siamatis, is a West Point grad, and his son just got accepted in. He was graduating senior, just got accepted in, so they dropped him off just last week. They were dropping him off. So Tom was just talking to me about how, all those feelings of when he went there just came like rushing back to him. So I know there's a history there and camaraderie that is pretty special.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So his son just started what is called cadet basic training. It is more commonly referred to as Beast Barracks. It's a 6-week orientation program for how we onboard new students and help them make that transition from being a civilian to being a soldier. He will form some of his best friends as that experience. Additionally, it is something he will routinely refer back to when thinking about how he seeks to navigate challenges and things that he learned about self as a result of being put under intense stress. It is a demanding undertaking, but it is also one that's very galvanizing in terms of really helping people to understand that they can push past perceived limits and learn how to be a more effective team member, learn how to digest large volumes of information quickly, and to discern what's important from that. So it's something you never forget.
Well, that's an interesting transition because I may tell just real quickly how we met. And so I was looking, it was 2018, five years ago now, which is hard to believe. Time flies by, I guess. But, we had this idea to create an event for our top advisors, and we called it our AE Leadership Summit. And we decided in this first year of it, which was 2018, if we're going to do this and do it well, and it's going to be all focused on leadership, we had to go to West Point. So we have a mutual friend, Don Yeager, who connected us, and you helped get us to West Point, which was awesome. You were able to tour us through there, really talk about the traditions, but then really lead some sessions with our advisors speaking on the topic of leadership. And so it was just really great. I should do this more often to go back and review so many of my notes from our time with you there at West Point. But one thing, I set it up a little bit, I guess, by talking about what you've done post West Point, but maybe share just how leadership became a journey for you and the things that you've done in the leadership realm since West Point.
Yeah, so I'll start with the first question about how leadership became a journey for me. Growing up, I loved sports, still do. And from a young age, was immersed in team sports. And one of the things I always noted was that the teams that tended to perform the best always had some individuals or a group of people that were committed to unlocking the potential resident in each member of the team. And so you could see a team that had arguably less qualified or less talented athletes be outperformed by a group that was more cohesive and more willing to work in a collaborative manner to bring about their desired outcome. And so I started to recognize this, and I had to start to decide, hey, I want to be one of those individuals that helps elevate how we perform, because I love to compete, but more importantly, I love to help feel as if I made those around me better, and that I allowed myself to be a vessel for helping somebody else to succeed. And so this love of leadership really started as a young child from playing sports. Now you fast forward to high school, I voluntarily elected to pursue formal positions of leadership, if you would, through student government and team captaincy and things like that. And I enjoyed those opportunities. You open yourself up to critique, but at the same time, you also amplify your ability to drive impact. And so that just kind of kept growing over time, seeking out positions where you were vested with legitimate authority, seeking out opportunities where you could amplify impact, um, thinking about how could you best be of service to those around you. And it just has continued this very day. So long story short, started when I was a kid through the vehicle that is sports. It's now become part of everything I do, whether it's in the home or professionally.
I want to talk about some of the things at West Point that you shared with us, that you taught us. And I wasn't going to ask this, but you mentioned this 6-week onboarding process, and I was looking at my notes, and I'm going to refer to them here and there again. But one of the notes that I made for us personally at our business, I think for any other business owner listening to this, you said, West Point has a very structured onboarding process with the goal that it leads to getting rid of the dead weight at the end of the process. And there's ways that they're testing along the way. And I think a lot of times as business owners, when we hire people, we're not probably as thorough or thoughtful in making sure that we've got the right fit and that we have this process. Could you talk a little bit about that, and just maybe how as a business owner you can apply that West Point onboarding process to your own business?
Yeah, absolutely. So, many times the way we evaluate potential is simply through a cursory examination of where someone's been in the past. And while that might look really good on paper, it does not necessarily mean that when actually put into a new environment, that they're going to constitute a great fit. If you take a look at the success rate for executive search, it's 50%. Now, that's a process where organizations spend a lot of money, time, and energy on trying to find the right candidate. But there's only a 50% likelihood that that candidate will still be with the organization 18 months later. And why is that? Because there are a lot of different factors that account for whether or not somebody is going to flourish or flounder inside the organization. And so a lot of companies just do not spend adequate time thinking about, beyond skill set, does this person have the right motivation? How effective is this person at learning? To what extent does this person want to become a valued member of the team, or is this individual simply intent on trying to extract as much value from the organization as they can, but not really opening themselves up to, say, sacrificing on behalf of the organization? And so during those first 6 weeks at West Point, we really test people's motivation, because folks come to West Point for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's because of the prestige. Sometimes it's because they were strongly encouraged by a member of their family. Other times it's because it's a full tuition scholarship. Name your thing, people show up there for a variety of reasons. And we have to ferret out, are they there for the right reasons? Now, if they aren't there for the right reasons, that doesn't make them a bad person. But it does mean that it's probably not going to be a great fit. And if they're not there for the right reasons, the likelihood that they're going to open themselves up to the prospect of really stressing themselves over time is probably really low. And West Point's not about simply coming there and emerging 4 years later and knowing more stuff. It's about reimagining who you are and what you can be and the links you'll go to in service of being an effective leader in the United States Army and beyond. And so we, over those 6 weeks, we test motivations. Are you team player? Do you believe in what we believe in? Are you open to the prospect of learning how to do things in a different way? How do you handle stress? Do you bring others along for the ride, or do you only look out for self first? And I think companies could spend more time doing that. When we think about the importance of socialization, it's not that you want to hire folks that are exactly like you. West Point's a very diverse place. People come with every kind of background, and they come with a wide array of perspectives and beliefs. And that's a good thing, because it allows us to leverage that diversity in service of addressing complex challenges. And so one of the things that companies do many times is they tend to focus on, oh, this person, they're going to be a great fit. But if fit is what you're most concerned with, as opposed to, do they bring the right set of skills? Do they bring things that we need to tap into? is if they don't necessarily appear on the surface to be a great fit, but they have the right set of skills and they have the right values. Hire for skill and potential, not necessarily for, oh, this person just reminds me of me. Because many times what you need is not another you. You actually need the opposite of you. But never hire somebody whose values and beliefs are going to violate the principles that your organization holds near and dear. Because there's a way in which you can bring in somebody who's different, but still their values align with your values. And so a lot of companies just don't spend enough time on that. And, that process is very cursory, and socialization matters. It matters a lot. And I think today what we're finding is that process is being complicated by the number of organizations that are going to extremely flexible work arrangements. And thus you have team members that will never have physically met one another. And it's not to say that's a bad thing. It just means they're going to have to think more intently about how do we onboard people? How do we create social glue? How do we export values and beliefs? How do we ensure people understand here are our left and right limits inside this organization? How do we ensure we create an environment where people are going to be vulnerable with one another and consent to learn from one another? West Point does not take that for granted. It's so important that we spend that time before they ever start academic classes to get that process right.
One thing you said on that, on getting it right, and you were talking a little bit about values. One of the other things I wrote down was you said West Point is a privilege, not a right. You can pass all your classes, you can pass all the tests, but if you're not meeting the standards and the values that West Point holds people to, you can still be dismissed. And I just, that was another, to me, the whole idea of onboarding or getting the right people in there, how important the standards and values are. And because I made a note, do we have a great process to onboard and make sure that we're weeding people out? But then also, do we dismiss if they don't meet our standards? And I think for a lot of business and business owners, we would probably be lying to ourselves if we said we always dismiss someone if we didn't feel that they met the standards there. So any thoughts around that with West Point?
Yeah, one, we make the standards very clear. Two, we give people lots of feedback. Three, we help people to always understand, how are you doing here? And, the other thing about dismissal has a negative connotation, which is different than how do we help individuals transition from the organization if, in fact, there is not a good alignment between the organization's needs and how they're approaching their activities. And so I believe a leader's role is always to put people in a position to win. And sometimes the best way to do that is to say, hey, given what your interests consist of and the things that you believe and hold near and dear, and given what this organization's interests consist of and the way in which we seek to go about it, we have lots of behavioral indicators that suggest that this is not a good fit. And so let's talk about what would constitute a better fit, either in some other part of this organization or in another organization. If it doesn't work out, that doesn't mean the person's a bad person. It just means they might not be in the right place for them. And so I try to use language that's more positively oriented, because dismissal, just like the word failure and countless others, just does not have a positive orientation. But if you say, hey, what can we do to put you in a position to win? What's the right transition for you? And what's the right transition for this organization? Transitions, always think about moving on to another opportunity. An opportunity has a positive connotation. And so I think a lot of organizations don't help their people to transition. They don't take an active role in trying to put that person in a position to win. They just hope that person wins once they become part of their organization. And so there are times that I look at somebody in West Point and goes, this is not a good fit for you. You're not happy as a result of the lack of fit. It's marginalizing your performance. Boom, 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 boom. So what would be an environment in which you could bring your full self to bear? And many times you find out that environment's not the military. that environment's not a service academy, and
Yeah.
that's okay. Same thing's true in organizations, but a lot of managers don't have open and honest conversations that are behaviorally anchored and are devoid of judgment when they're dialoguing with their peers. And so somebody says, "What's the right time to fire somebody?" I said, "Probably the minute you started thinking about it." Like,
Yeah.
but we hold on and we are reluctant to have those conversations because we don't want to deal with the anxiety that it causes. We believe that, hey, maybe things will just turn around. Um, and so we're just kind of using hope as a method, and we're just tolerating mediocrity. And so, I think it's okay if somebody says, "Hey, this might not be the right organization for you, but let's work on helping you transition to one where you can flourish." But that requires open and honest dialogue, objective, timely, devoid of judgment.
Well, and I think it goes to the power of leadership. I wanted to share just a few notes, few things that jumped out at me as I went back and reviewed from our time there 5 years ago. And I might just throw a couple of these out, and I'll throw them out one at a time and let you kind of comment on them if that works. But
Yeah.
one of the things that you said, a note I wrote was, and it kind of goes to this point we were just talking about. That's why I'm going to start with that. But you said, the leader serves as a catalyst to unleash the potential of the individual. So just share, like, as a leader, why that is so important.
Absolutely. Well, first, I maintain that no one comes to work to fail. And I had a friend who once told me something that's always stuck with me. And says, "I've never met a bad employee, but I have met employees who fail to meet the right leader." And so if you believe in this notion that no one comes to work to fail, but you see somebody who's clearly not soaring, a leader's opportunity is not to simply to go and to critique that individual. A leader's opportunity is to say, what will it take for you to bring your best self to bear? And sometimes that best self might not be a good fit for what the organization needs. But other times, if you can unlock that potential and turn this person who was a pessimist into an optimist, turn this person who was holding back into somebody who's putting it all on the line, to turn this person into somebody who is very guarded with their peers, into somebody who's very engaged with their peers. Unlocking that potential is how you achieve the full value proposition for the organization. Unlocking potential is always important as a leader. It's the most important thing I think leaders do, is how do they engage others in a way that galvanizes their willingness to do that which is necessary to accomplish the mission, but also puts that person on a path to where they're continually growing their capabilities. And as a result of that, creating new opportunity. It's accomplish the mission and improve the organization. You improve the organization by improving the people therein. Mm-hmm. And so in order to improve people, you've got to galvanize their willingness to go on that journey. It's kind of like growing a muscle. To grow a muscle, you have to tear it. Tear it too little, doesn't get any stronger. Tear it too much, irreparable harm. You tear it the right way, and the fibers grow back stronger. Great leaders and great leader developers are always engaged in a purposeful series of tears in themselves and in their teammates. However, they control the amount of tear in service of creating stronger capabilities. And so I think a great leader is always trying to unlock potential because it's part of that process of tearing muscle. If you don't tear muscle, it ultimately leads to atrophy and obsolescence. Same thing's true in an organization. If you're not building new capabilities, it ultimately leads to mediocrity, and ultimately the organization ceases to exist. And so a leader's job is not to make their people comfortable. A leader's job is to impart discomfort. Said a different way, and I tell this to my kids and I tell this to my teams, you must permanently seek discomfort in order to live a comfortable life. And so I look at folks and go, tell me what tears you're making in each one of your team members. Why does that tear matter? How are you controlling the amount of tear, which means you don't just go and act a tear and walk off. You have to be there as part of the support structure. And so this unlocking potential is a big one for me. It's because it's there, but many times it's lying dormant because that person might not know how to awaken that potential. Additionally, they might be scared, they might not be adequately supported if they take certain risks. And so it's just a huge concept for me. And it's something I learned at West Point that, they're going to encourage you to take risk, but you're also going to be supported by this amazing structure of people who are dedicated to fostering your development as a leader. And many times, if you ask folks inside organizational settings, do you feel adequately supported by those around you? The answer is no. There's a very famous study that has been replicated many times, and this study was commissioned in the 1990s. And we still find the same findings to this very day, that overwhelmingly, employees say the most stressful part of their job is their immediate supervisor. Overwhelmingly. And so if you don't feel adequately supported by your immediate supervisor, what's the likelihood you're going to take on significant risk? And the answer is a scan. It's scan.
Yep.
And so if you want people to take those risks, if you want people to dare to challenge convention and everything else, they have to feel as if you have their back. And that's why I think this notion of the best leaders are always intent on unlocking potential, but they do it by encouraging people to take risk and supporting them as they take those risks.
Well, and I think it's so important. So many of the advisors we support, started off where maybe it was just them, some maybe a spouse or one or two employees. And now as those organizations are growing and scaling, you have to make that transition from where you're doing a lot of it to now where you're empowering, getting other people to do it. And it's a big adjustment that many have to make, but those that do it well do exactly what you said. They unleash that potential. So one of the other things that I highlighted that you said, and I'm going to ask you to expand upon it a little bit, because I often say it's probably the most violated leadership principle in my opinion. And that's, I'm going to call it lead by example. But what you said is people are always watching the leader. And as the leader, you have to know your people are always watching. So talk about the importance of that.
Absolutely. So lead by example is one of those euphemisms that people constantly throw out. I believe in leadership by example. I'm like, well, here's the interesting thing. Whether you believe it or not, it's true. Now, many times when people use that phrase, what they're thinking about is conducting themselves as the exemplar for what right looks like. But people are always watching. It's not just when you, quote unquote, are on. It's for everything. And so it's a hard thing for a lot of folks to understand that once you assume a position of authority, that there is no off the clock, so to speak. People are watching the things you say on social media. They're watching the way in which you engage with those around you. Do you treat people with dignity and respect always? Or do you bifurcate in terms of I treat those who are more senior than me with tremendous respect? Those who are junior to me, I treat them in very divisive ways. And so it's this funny thing where a lot of folks believe that it's like a light switch they can turn on and off. Oh, right now I'm on, so I'm going to be my best self. Now I'm going to turn the switch off and I'm going to be my real self. And when I'm my real self, it doesn't really matter. No one's really watching, so on and so forth. But people are always watching. People are always commenting. And so it's the level of visibility that others have into people's lives has been amplified because of the advent of technology and the rise of social media. So something as simple as what you elect to like when you look at somebody else post, people will comment on that. They're like, oh, I saw you like so-and-so. Well, that's really different than, what you say our company's about or name your thing. And so it's a really important lesson for people to learn that they're not just watching when you want them to watch. They're always watching. And to some, that's a burden. And to others, it's just one of the things that comes along with electing to lead. But leadership by example is not something that, you can choose to believe in, because it's a fact. It's a fact. for all things.
That's good. Final one, then we'll jump into some other questions. You said the average American reads less than one book per year. The average CEO reads over 30. And I know one of the things that you were, we talked a lot about there was just this idea of personal development and being intentional about how you're growing. And I think for a lot of leaders, as you're stepping into more and more of a leadership role, this is important. So I'll just throw that out and let you share a little thought around that also.
Absolutely. I mean, if we know anything, it's that the world is changing around us rapidly. And if you are not committed to having a continual learning orientation, you will quickly find yourself leveraging outdated information in a context whereby how you approach things is not going to yield positive results. And so it's adapt or die. We need to learn in order to maintain our relevance. And a lot of folks don't go about that in a structured way. Now, some folks do it by periodically going back to school. Others devote themselves to constantly refreshing their information through a strict reading regimen. Others still, it's by positing questions routinely that are powerful questions to explore to those around them and seeking to gain insight from the answers that people elect to provide them. You can go about it in a variety of ways, but the most effective leaders are the ones who learn most effectively and can apply those insights in an adroit manner. And so whether it's updating our professional understanding, whether it's updating our social understanding, whether it's updating our, just understanding of human behavior, if you're not learning, you're dying. Plain and simple. And so people who operate at the highest levels, they understand that and they dedicate time, which is their most precious resource, to fostering their enhanced understanding of a variety of topics. Others seek the comfort associated with, this is what I believe. I'm just going to continue to believe this. And you're just going to have to accept that. This is who I am. Just deal with it. It's like, great. Well, who you are and what you believe might make you feel good, but it doesn't mean you're going to produce outstanding results. So prime example, if somebody says, I'm just not a technologist. I don't want to spend time on that stuff. But yet you're an advisor and you're not learning about cryptocurrency or blockchain or the impact that's going to have on financial markets or how organizations go about investing their resources, name your thing. If you're just like, no, I'm just an old school, we stick to this, there's no need to know that stuff, then yeah, how you go about it might serve you well in a very specific context. But as soon as you leave that context, that reluctance to understand different contexts is going to eat your lunch. And so you just have to be committed to continuing to learn always in ways big and small and experimenting with your knowledge. And I think, the crypto example is a classic one, just like blockchain and just like a number of other technologies that have emerged that now influence what transpires in financial markets.
Mm-hmm. There was maybe a couple follow-ups there. One thing that I've done since our time together 5 years ago, you talked about the idea of a to-learn list, not a to-do list. And so since then, and you said it's not just that you write down the things that you want to learn, but then you have to develop a game plan around those. So now every year when I do my planning, part of mine is my to-learn list. So what topics do I want to learn more about? Into specifically what books or authors on this subject, am I going to read that year? What events am I going to go to? So that was just a huge, developing that and being not just like, hey, I want to learn more about leadership, but then very specifically, okay, what's the game plan to learn more about leadership? And I know that was a big thing that you talked about. So just any thoughts around that idea of a to-learn list?
Yeah, I mean, we all have a to-do list, tasks that we need to accomplish. But this notion of a to-learn list, things we need to explore. The to-do list is about generating comfort. The to-learn list is about generating the discomfort. Because when we knock out things on our to-do list, we feel good, right? Like, all right, I got that done. Great. I'm a little more comfortable now. So everything on our to learn list is usually around creating the discomfort. Like, wow, I have to go explore something that I don't have a lot of insight on. I have to go explore something that might be difficult to understand. I have to go do something that is going to, stretch my capabilities. And both are important. We need to do things, but we also need to learn things. They're two sides of the same coin. And you have to balance both sides in order to get maximum value out of it. But many times we myopically focus to the to-do list because there's immediacy with that.
Mm-hmm.
There is that comfort factor. But you've got to think about the to learn list as well. And many times people just tend to focus on the to-do list and they're not thinking intently about the to learn list.
One of the other things that you said that just kind of ties back to this idea of constantly learning, and I think the crypto is a great example of that. You said West Point is always asking the question of what will we need in the future, and I think you even walked us through. If you look at let's just call it military strategy as an example, like how much that has changed and evolved. Just heck over the last 40, 50 years, how much that has changed and evolved to the point where West Point is always talking about where things going, what do we have to do, what roles are we going to need, how do we have to change. And so I don't know if there's a ton of additional thoughts, but it just, that crypto example reminded me of that, of the world is changing, and if you don't change, adapt, and learn, like, you're going to be left behind.
Absolutely. And so if you take a look at West Point, one of the ways in which we think about preparing our students is what are the foundational skills they will require in order to be successful in the near term, and what are the topics they need exposure to, because those topics are likely to become very important in the future. And so we're constantly looking at what's the right curriculum in order to give students access to both things. And that curriculum is routinely updated. And so when I was a cadet at West Point, we were very math, science, and engineering heavy. Very math, science, and engineering heavy. I was a political science major at West Point, yet I still had to take Calculus 1, Calculus 2, Calculus 3, differential equations, and probability and statistics. That was the minimum number of math courses that you could take. Even though I was a poli-sci major, I had to take electrical engineering, civil engineering, thermofluid dynamics, 2 semesters of physics, 2 semesters of chemistry. It was very math, science, engineering intensive. Today, the curriculum still has a significant amount of math, science, engineering, but we've also expanded exposure to other topics because of the importance of fostering critical thinking. The engineering problem-solving methodology works well for a variety of things, but it's not the only way to address complex challenges. And so giving cadets more access to courses in liberal arts and a variety of other disciplines has become very, very important so that they can think broadly about how they might address complex challenges. And so I think for organizations, you have to do the same thing. It's, what are we ensuring that our people get exposed to in service of enhancing how they think about topics and broadening how they approach challenges. And so some organizations have corporate universities, others have, developmental programs that could be short-term or long-term in duration. Others still have, hey, here's a targeted reading list. Name your thing. People go about it in a whole slew of ways, but not hoping that your people learn, but incentivizing your people to learn and holding them accountable for learning is absolutely essential. Absolutely essential. And that's one of the things that West Point does. West Point holds people accountable for learning. And the Army does as well. You go through school on a regular interval when you're a member of the United States Armed Forces. You go back to school on average every 4 years throughout your entire career. And then you've got more targeted developmental interventions interspersed between those long duration courses. But it can be as simple as, we're putting you on this project because we need you to learn this new skill for X. Like, you have no experience in finance. We want you to get some finance experience. Doesn't mean we have to put you into a full-time finance role, but I can put you on this short duration 6-week project that's going to get you that exposure. Cool. So just thinking creatively about how you expose people to different things in service of rounding out their understanding of organizational topics is really important. And so you're going to have members of, let's say, a wealth team that, hey, I'm the invested, I'm the ops, I'm the investor relations, blah, blah, blah. Great. You could sit there and say, well, everyone just stays inside their swim lane. But if you want to build a better team that has greater understanding, how do you give every member of the team exposure to what the other members of the team do, so they can enhance how they go about their activities? I think there's tremendous value associated with that.
That's really good. Oh, okay. Now we're going to get into actual questions that I wanted to ask you when we were together. This was just as I started looking back on all my notes, but no, Joe, you've answered a lot of those. But one question I wanted to ask you, because we didn't really talk about it a lot when we were together, but the advisors we support, let's just say anyone listening to this, as they are leading growing organizations, what becomes really important is identifying individuals within those organizations with maybe the most leadership potential and really developing those. Is there a process that you've found or an approach to best identify the individuals that have that leadership potential?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So first, I live under the guise that everyone has leadership potential. It does not mean that everyone will be construed as an outstanding leader in a given context. And so most organizations, we try to find who has the most potential, and then we throw all of our energy into that group. And we ignore the potential possessed by everyone else. So I think the best organizations bet on everyone, but they make differentiated bets. And so finding that group that has the most potential is really important, because they produce an outsized amount of the organizational outcomes.
Yeah.
And so for that group, I want to target them. And then let's say I put a $2 bet on them. Then there's the majority of people that, hey, they're not as good as that group, but they still account for a lot of what happens around here. I want to put a $1 bet on them. And then there's a group that I say, hey, they're not setting the world on fire necessarily, but still, we require them to do things. I'm going to put a 50-cent bet on them. The best organizations bet on everyone, but they make differentiated bets. Most organizations find that most talented group, and they put all their energy into that group. And that group, you're right to put a lot of energy into, but you're leaving everybody else to chance. And so I'm a big believer at bet on everyone. You hired them for a reason. You hired them for a reason. Everybody can get better. Everyone can grow. Now, if we go back to the question of how do you identify your highest potential, I always look for things like, do they get things done? Do they work in a way where others are willing to be influenced by them? Are they committed to learning? How do they deal with setbacks? When they win, do they gloat or do they share credit? So there's a number of things that you can utilize when saying, who here has the most potential. But those are just some of the ones I look at. Good. Leaders have to get things done. So do they get things done? Leaders have to work with others. So do they work with others well? Leaders have to pick themselves up and pick others up when things don't go well. So do they have the ability to get knocked down and stand back up again? Leaders have to deal with setbacks. So are they resolute? So it's not any one thing. I think it's a combination of things. But when I start to see that gestalt, if you would, I can start to say, hey, that's somebody I believe has the ability to take others along for the ride and to generate more value because of their engagement than would otherwise come to fruition without their engagement.
That's good.
I always say that if you get handed 5 people and all you generate is the summation of their individual efforts, then you've created no value and thus you have no value. If I hand you 5, you better create 6 or better, because you're unlocking something that otherwise would not come to fruition without your intervention. And so I look for the people who do that, because if all they do is, hey, they just ensure that the 5 people turn their work in on time, well, that's not unlocking value.
Yeah, that's a good manager, not a good leader. They managed to make sure it got done. So
Yeah.
in that same, so as people are leading a growing organization, one of the other things I see sometimes is they may encounter someone who is in a leadership role but struggling. So I wanted to ask you, how do you either identify, is this person not right for that role, or is it just something where they need a little more help, a little more support, a little more development? Is there a process to identify, like, not the right leader versus, no, it has the potential to be the right leader, just needs a little more help and support?
Yeah, more so than a process, is there an action? And that action is dialogue. It's just through open and honest dialogue and highlighting behaviorally, here's what's transpiring. Contrast that with the gap between what has transpired and what needs to transpire, and then posing questions around, what do you think accounts for the gap, and what resources are required in order to address the gap successfully. And sometimes it might be the individual's capabilities, sometimes it might be the individual's mindset, other times it might be the individual's reluctance to work collaboratively with those around them. But it all starts and ends with dialogue. Starts and ends with dialogue, because starts with the dialogue to pose the questions. It ends with the dialogue to say, okay, now, given what we've learned, what actions have to be undertaken? But many folks don't actually talk with their teams on a regular basis. They make statements, but they don't actually engage in meaningful dialogue. And they don't pose powerful questions. And so many times it's something that turn out why. We've been taught to start with why, right? Simon Sinek says, start with why. Everybody, we've all been taught, start with why. But here's something that's interesting. There's a gentleman or a woman by the name of Tasha Eurich. She wrote a book called Insight. And in the book, she's a psychologist by training. She discovered that this adage of start with why, from a psychological perspective, leads to flawed results. Because when we start with why, especially if we're dealing with something that's challenging or can be anxiety producing, that because of what we call cognitive dissonance, we seek to reduce the anxiety we feel. And thus, we can convince ourselves of why we did something, but actually we've created a false narrative. When you start with why, you open up the prospect of creating a mistruth. So her work revealed that you always have to ask what questions, and what questions posed routinely ultimately reveal the why. And so if you go to somebody and say, why is your team floundering? They can come up with a convincing narrative that they totally believe, but is false, which is different than, what difficulty did you have on this project? What challenges did you have in addressing this concern? Boom, 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 boom. What done in a rigorous way can reveal the why. And embedded in those what, you remove statements of judgment and you insert tangible behaviors. And so for a lot of folks, people always start with why, when you need to be, what challenges did you experience? What accounts for this decision? What did you experience when you got to this juncture in the project? But that dialogue done in a proper way can start to identify gaps in either thinking, capability, resilience, you name it. And once you have a cogent awareness of the gap, then you can start to create targeted interventions to address the gap.
That's some great language there to use for everyone. So another question I had, just curious more so, is there someone in your life that has poured and invested the most into you? And if so, is there maybe one or two big things that you learned from them?
Well, I think I'd be I'd do a disservice to the many
Hmm.
if I elected to only highlight the one.
Yeah.
And so, said a different way, there have been countless people who have poured energy into me, some of who held big jobs and others who did not have lofty titles. And I've learned something from each and every one of them. There have been some individuals and some teams that have helped me to realize things about myself or organizational life that have had a lasting influence on how I think about those things. But if we go back to, I think the greatest leadership lab that most folks ever encounter is their own home. I go back to the influence of my grandfather and my grandmother on my father's side. So Hayes and Roberta Banks lived in Lynchburg, Virginia. Both of them had formal educations that it did not extend beyond the sixth grade. And they raised six kids in the segregated South. My grandfather was a heavy equipment operator for the Mead Corporation. So he drove a big crane that moved logs from one place to another as part of a paper mill. And he was a very religious individual. And he was very, very keen, as was my grandmother, on the importance of getting a great education, even though he did not have access to one. And so this individual, possessing of a sixth grade education, and his wife put all six of their kids through college, and all six of them graduated, living in the segregated South. And I remember as a young child that whenever I would go to visit my grandparents and all my uncles and aunts would be there, that as soon as you came in, there'd be lots of hugs and laughter and everything. And then as a grandchild, they'd sit you in a chair right in the kitchen and they'd start peppering you with questions about how you doing in school, what's going on with sports, what are you doing in terms of, name your thing. It ran the gamut, and it came to be known as sitting in the bank's hot seat. And those interactions, which sometimes could become pretty heated and very pointed, and were always done from a place of love, but also they were done to challenge you. It was in those interactions that I learned what it meant to be truly engaged and truly supportive. Somebody committed to pushing, but somebody who was always loving at the same time. And so I came to call that hug and push, that you're always got your arms around your team saying, I'm always going to be there for you, but I'm never going to let the moss grow beneath your feet. We're always going to be pushing to get you to a better place. And so I learned hug and push from my immediate family, and they pushed hard. I was the oldest grandchild, and there most certainly was an expectation set that you would stand on the shoulders of those who came before you, and that the sacrifices that my grandparents made, that I had an obligation to extend the risks they took in service of creating opportunity for those they loved. And I've extended that into, how I think about raising my own family. I think about, serving the teams that I'm a part of. But I learned that you have to be willing to be engaged by others, and you have to engage others. You have to be willing to be pushed, and you have to push others. You have to love on others, and you have to be open to receiving love. And so my grandfather, to me, when people say, tell me about the greatest leader we've ever known, I don't go to the Gandhis or whatever. I'm like, I never met Gandhi. I never met, so and so. But I did meet my grandfather. And, by any definition, I think he was an amazing leader because he unlocked dormant potential. He took risk. He made investments. He was there to pick you up when you fell down, and he was there to celebrate your triumphs when those occurred, as was my grandmother. I mean, I think they were an extraordinary couple, that took ordinary people and helped them to accomplish extraordinary things. And so I always think about them as an example of what great leadership looks like and what great leadership can engender. Does that make sense?
It does. It also, I was going to ask a question, but now I know the answer about your drive for education, especially, you've gotten degrees from some, prestigious schools, but I think I know where that drive came from now.
It most certainly came from that in part. But it also came from a significant setback I suffered as an undergrad. So if we go back to West Point, I had two goals as a child. I wanted to go to West Point and I wanted to be a pilot like my dad. And get to West Point, great. And at West Point, everything's graded. How you're doing in your classes, how you're doing militarily, how you're doing physically. Well, militarily, top 5% of my class. Had no problem with the military stuff. Physically, top 5% of my class. I was a Division I intercollegiate athlete, loved sports. But academically, I had wrongly convinced myself that there was just a certain set of courses that, try as I may, I wasn't going to do well in. I wasn't going to fail. I just wasn't going to set the world on fire. I have to say I never made either dean's list, the good or the bad one. And, come senior year, because it's a corporate university, we're constantly keeping track of where you rank in your graduating class. And senior year, they take every member of the class and they say, here's every function you can go into in the corporation. And here's all the locations you can go to for your first assignment. And number one, what do you want? I want to be an infantry officer and I want to go to Vicenza, Italy for my first assignment. All right, take it off the board. So we go into the auditorium one night when they're going to reveal what you're going to get for your career field. So we had all submitted our preferences, and all I wanted, there was only one thing I wanted. I wanted to be a pilot. That was it. It was the only thing I wanted. Nothing else interested me at all. Only wanted to be a pilot. But I knew, given my class rank, that it was going to be close. But, my friend said, don't worry, Bernie. Things always work out for you. It'll be fine. And I was like, I don't know, man. But yeah, you know what? Things always do work out. So I'm going to get it. So we go in that night, long story short. They say, open your envelopes. And inside the envelope was the insignia for the career field you were going to enter into. And it was not aviation. It was field artillery. And my world imploded. I saw my life stream evaporate before my eyes. And I went into a legitimate depression for several weeks. I didn't want to get out of bed. I didn't want to do anything. I was like, how could this have happened? About 2 weeks later, they revealed some additional information where they showed, okay, for every career field, here's everyone that ended up in the career field. Here's the first person who got it. Here's the last person who got it. Here's everybody else that listed that as their first choice, but didn't get it. So here's the last person to get it, and here's everybody else below them. And for aviation, Fred Wellman got the last spot. Fred's a great guy. But they showed, all right, here's everybody else who wanted aviation, didn't get it. And I was the next name after Fred. Wow. Had there been one additional slot, I would have gone to flight school. I missed my life stream by one slot. And that only amplified my anguish. And I was like, I can't believe this has happened, And ultimately, when I found a quiet place internally, what I discovered was I hadn't been cheated. It's not as if somebody had moved the goalpost on me. I simply had not worked hard enough for the thing I said was my life's ambition. And in that moment, I swore I would never let apathy determine anything in my life ever again, nor would I let it determine the fate of anybody I cared about. I simply hadn't worked hard enough. And that's when I said, if ever afforded the opportunity to go to school in the future, anything less than my best is a no-go. And so I kind of went on this educational bender going, I'm going to show you that the undergraduate grades I achieved here were not reflective of my best effort. And that's why my friends find it absolutely comical that I somehow ended up in higher ed because I was not that person as an undergrad, not even close. Um, I'm no smarter than I was back then, but I am more resolute. I've learned how to engage self to a far, far better outcome. And you look at some of those schools that I've had the privilege of attending, they were hard. They were hard schools. I had to work my tail off at each one, but I never lacked motivation because of what had transpired back as an undergrad. And it took 4 years in the Army before I was finally able to find my way into aviation. But I never let go of the dream. I just kept working at it, just trying to figure out ways in which I could figure out how do I get through that door. And when I finally got to flight school, I was number one in my flight school class. I was number one in pretty much every military course I went to from that moment onward. And it wasn't because I was a different person. I just had learned how to engage the person I was more effectively. But more importantly, I also learned how to invest in others and get them to unlock their potential. Because if I go back to what had happened at West Point, if I had had some more folks like really kick me in the butt going, Bernie, you are not doing anywhere near what you're capable of doing, then that might not have happened. And the reason that didn't happen was because I wasn't, like I said, I wasn't bad and I wasn't amazing. I was just kind of comfortably numb in the middle. And at West Point, the two ends of the spectrum tend to get the most attention.
Yep.
Those who are the superstars and those who are the falling stars. But all the other stars in the constellation, they're just kind of left to shine on their own. And I was just one of those other stars in the constellation who wasn't getting in trouble, but who also wasn't like excelling. And so you just get periodic touches that would say, all right, you're not screwing up and you're not, rising up. So, just don't make any trouble. And so what I've tended to do from that moment onward, well, listen, the superstars and the falling stars are always going to get attention. I tend to focus my energy on the other stars in the constellation because that's where the majority of work happens. And, so if you can light the fire under that person who goes, do you really want to stay in middle management? Because if you do, that's okay. But you have the ability to be an executive. It's like, what's holding you back? Do you really want to, make 50,000 a year when you have the potential to make 100? Because I see that potential in you. So like, what's holding you back? And many times the things that are holding people back is just a lack of belief. It's not a lack of capability. And so my job is to unlock the power of belief and help them to foster the pursuit of excellence so that they can achieve the full measure of their potential, whatever that is.
That's really good. One of the things there that just hit me too, our mutual friend Don Yeager always says when he talks about characteristics of greatness or great people is that most of them have used adversity in some way to fuel what they've gone on to do. And you can see that adversity, then let that kind of fire underneath of you. So I think there's a great lesson there, though, of like, how do you light that fire without having to have people go through that same level of adversity also? So.
Yeah, I mean, it's, so there's a gentleman by the name of Warren Bennis who was a longtime professor at the University of Southern California's Marshall School of Business. And he wrote a great book called On Becoming a Leader. It's a classic treatise of leadership. And in that book, he details that many of the most accomplished leaders, they can all point to transformative experiences in their lives that galvanize their willingness to lead. And he said that those experiences primarily took one of three forms: prevailing through darkness, the adversity piece, prevailing through darkness, something bad happens and they find a way to emerge stronger from it. Learning from difference, being thrust into a very different environment and learning how to navigate it effectively. But a third way was called meeting great expectations, where somebody set the bar high and you cleared the bar. So while many times the prevailing through darkness and learning from difference are the most oft talked about significant challenges, you don't have to have everything be crappy in order to have value extracted from it. Sometimes it can simply be, I grew up in a great family and they taught me great values. I worked on a great team and I had an amazing manager who just really pushed me. And that can serve as the catalyst. And so A crucible is a transformative experience that forever fundamentally alters how you think or behave. But it always involves a trial. But trials don't have to be negative in orientation. They can also be positive. Like when you're set the bar really high for your team and you help them to achieve it, and you go, wow, I saw what we were capable of doing. And we didn't have to, be beaten or have to experience like this tremendous loss. It was just that I worked for somebody who had really high standards and pushed me to achieve them and maintain their optimism and everything else. That you can forever be fundamentally altered by that. So I think the point you're making, that a lot of leaders do point to the prevailing through darkness or learning from difference, because it's very visceral. But you also have ones who say, hey, everything I believe is because I worked for this amazing individual who got me to see that, guess what? More was possible. And that they believed in my ability to achieve more. But there's always a trial. There's always a trial. But the trial doesn't have to be terrible in its orientation.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, I like that, setting high standards and holding people to those. Okay, I want to ask you a quick culture question, then we'll jump into these lightning round questions because I know I've had you on here for a while. But one of the things I saw there, you almost have to go to West Point, I think, to feel it and see it, but it is, there's just a tremendous culture there. Are there approaches to culture that you found at West Point or in the military that you think should be applied more in the public or business sector?
I think it's a great question. So when we think about culture, there's a gentleman by the name of Edgar Schein. He's a longtime professor at MIT Sloan School of Management. And Schein's work on culture is widely cited by people and scholars around the globe. And he talks about the different elements of culture, whether it's the physical representations of the culture, which he calls artifacts, whether it's the statements we make about what we say we value, which he called espoused values, or whether it's just the most cherished beliefs, which he called underlying assumptions. And I think that for the organizations that really do this well is they think very intently about all three. What are those physical representations we want to put out into the world to highlight what matters to us? Things like your logo or your catch line or to close your, whatever it is. Some organizations are very thoughtful in those physical representations of what matters to them. The espoused values, that's things like your corporate value statement. But more so than having a pithy statement is that they have managers at every level that hold people accountable for behaving in a manner consistent with those statements. And I'll give you an example of this. I was once doing some work for a very large financial services concern in New York City, and I'm watching two protagonists in a meeting. And the meeting, they're both advocating for their perspective and trying to bring about a decision on something they were considering. And the meeting's very heated. They're dropping F-bombs and they're making veiled threats about the other one's, approach, so on and so forth. And afterwards, I'm out in the hallway talking with one of the protagonists. Says, well, that got pretty heated, And I said, talk to me about that, because I know one of your stated values is deep and abiding respect for people. And the individual says, yeah, that's bullshit. Around here, if you want to get ahead, you better have sharp elbows. And so what's printed is deep and abiding respect, but what's really believed is be combative. And I was always struck by that because it highlights that you can put anything you want on paper, but it's what you choose to celebrate or denigrate day in, day out that really governs how people behave. And I think for the best organizations, what they put on paper is what they actually hold people to account for. What they put up as a physical representation is truly reflective of their truth. And what they tend to celebrate as most near and dear to them is truly an immovable object. And so West Point thinks very intently about all three of those things, as does the Army, and as do a number of organizations. But I look at organizations today that might say, like, we believe in fostering inclusion and dignity and respect and bring your full self to work. That's the statement they make. But if I ask somebody, what's your reality like? Do you believe that you can do what's printed there. And they're like, absolutely not. Diversity efforts don't fail because we can't find diverse people or ideas. They fail or fail to achieve their stated intent because we find them and then encourage them to act in a homogeneous manner, thus suppressing the value of the diversity. And I think organizations that really go about this well, they have clarity of what matters to them. They have clarity of what the behaviors are that are congruent with those beliefs. And most importantly, they have strong accountability for holding people feet to the fire on behaving in a manner consistent with those expressed beliefs. But it always, excellence cannot be achieved through a lack of accountability. And so one of the things that West Point does well is they hold the students accountable for how they behave. And I think the same thing's true in the best private sector organizations. Most organizations are not accountable. They're partially accountable. They hold people's feet to the fire for some things, and for others, they allow deviations from the standard. And they allow that gap to exist so long as they're producing good enough outcomes. The best organizations are the ones that do their basics better than anyone else. Plain and simple. The best organizations are ones that do their basics better than anyone else. And there's a quote that for years was misattributed to Aristotle, but it was actually penned by Will Durant, talking about the great philosophers. And it says that excellence is not an act, but a habit. We are what we repeatedly do. And so for most organizations, I think the opportunity that's available to them is simply to become more accountable for the things they say they are actually committed to embody. Plain and simple. Closing the gap, what I call the say-do ratio. If you say it, do you do it? It should be 1-to-1. But for many organizations, it's not. And so what will it take for you to go from being partially accountable to accountable? That's the opportunity.
That's good. I love that. And you saw it. I saw so much of that through the artifacts, the values, the things that you see there at West Point. Okay, let me ask you some quick lightning round questions. These can be short answers. Just ask them at the end of all of these. But first one is this. COVID, I think for everyone, or let's just say even 2020 was an interesting time. Is there a lesson that you learned over the past 2 years that was maybe something new that you think you'll carry forward for the rest of your career or life?
I don't know if it was necessarily new, but it reinforced the belief I already possessed, which was mission first, people always. So that's a phrase we have in the Army. Mission first, people always. No matter what the environmental conditions, we have to accomplish the mission. So even if the economy shuts down, we've got to find a way to still do what we do, right? So mission first, but people always. You can't accomplish the mission without the people. And you can't sacrifice the people in service of saying that's what the mission requires. It's that you have to find a way to say, what do we have to do in order to ensure we do what we do well while taking care of our people at the same time? And that's not about coddling them or scaling back. It's about honoring their needs and putting them in a position to win. And I think over the last couple of years, it's reinforced my belief in the importance of both things. That you can't go, oh, it's just so hard out here, let's just give up. No, we don't have that luxury. But while we are doing what's necessary to accomplish the mission, we can't do it in a way that says we're ignoring people's needs. And I think the organizations that have navigated this turbulence most effectively have kept both of those understandings at the forefront of their actions. How do we take care of our people while ensuring that we're putting our people in a position to win so that we can accomplish the mission?
Yeah, that's really good. And I think you're right. The best ones did that really, really well. Okay, second question. What is the one thing that you've done to graduate from being a good leader to a great leader?
Learn from others.
Perfect. It's a simple one. Third question. Is there anything that you're doing this year to drive your own personal growth that you're excited about?
Going back to that to learn list. So I joined the board of a publicly traded financial services institution about Q4 of last year. And so this is what we call a digitally forward institution and kind of a fintech, but it's also a bank. And so I'm having to learn a lot
Oh, wow.
about uh, digital finance in service of being able to execute my governance responsibilities well. And so having to really pour into that is something that I'm doing, um, so I can be a good team member.
It's very cool. Okay, fourth question. What is the one book that you've recommended most to other leaders?
One book that I've recommended most to other leaders. Wow, that's a really good one. I'd probably say it's On Becoming a Leader by Dennis,
Perfect. I have not had that
because
one yet. So that's a
helping
good one.
people to really mind their own experiences is super important. I mean, possessing a high level of self-awareness is essential to being a great
Mhm.
leader, because you can't do it all, but you need to know what accounts for why you do things the way you do it, what are your superpowers, and what are your blind spots. And you build a team around you that fills in the blind spots, and you leverage your superpowers to help advance the team to the greatest extent possible. Um, and I think Bennis's book helps everybody to recognize we've all had experiences in our lives that are so powerful that they continue to have a meaningful impact on how we elect to live our lives. And so reading the stories of others can help unlock insight for self. And that insight can prove very useful when thinking about why would you elect to lead, and do you believe in your ability to lead well. And one of the stories he tells is about Teddy Roosevelt as a cavalry officer in a conflict early on. And he was leading a company of cavalry soldiers, and he fell off his horse in the middle of a battle. You know, and up until that point, he had never thought of himself as a leader. He never thought of himself as having that ability to get out front and, rally others to his cause. But he learned in that experience how to overcome adversity and that people would rally behind him. And it forever changed how he viewed self. Um, and so that experience of falling off his horse in battle and picking himself up and getting people to follow him was transformative for him. And I think there's always power in exploring the stories of others, because they can also help us to explore our own stories more effectively. And I think Bennis's book does that in a very wonderful way.
That's great. Okay, final question. What's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Be humble and tenacious. Many times people don't believe that the two can coexist, but if you're humble, that means you open yourself up to the prospect of learning from those around you. And if you're tenacious, you'll take whatever you've learned and you'll do what it takes to bring it to fruition. Be humble and tenacious.
That's really good. In fact, one of the other guests we've had on, Tim Elmore, said one great leaders balance confidence and humility, which is very similar, right? Of they're confident in their ability, but they're also humble in knowing that they don't know it all. So, General Banks, it has been an honor to have you on today. If people, one, I should say first, thank you for everything you do to pour into leaders. Thank you for serving our country. If listeners wanted to learn more about you, your approach to leadership, are there some ways that they can do that?
I am easily scouted out on LinkedIn. So Bernard Banks at Northwestern University. Also, you can go to Northwestern Kellogg website under faculty and find my name there. I am not hard to find. I don't have a robust social media presence, so I don't have a Twitter handle or Instagram or anything like that. Um, but I am always willing to engage with people who are desirous of trying to make the world around them a better place. So whether somebody sends me an email directly, because my email address can be found on either one of those platforms, I am always open to having a conversation and hopefully we can make a positive difference in the lives of those around us.
Well, you've done exactly that, and I appreciate you taking the time. And if you enjoyed this episode, make sure you share it with some friends that are trying to grow in their leadership capacity also.